Well, tonight we're going to do a quick overview of the things we were talking about last week, which is a study of logic and how you actually prove something to be true, how to look at some argument that someone is making, whether they're arguing for something or against something, and be able to tell if that actually makes sense or not. And I also want you to have this as a foundation, because the rest of the presentation that we're going to go through is also going to be based on this too. I'm going to be setting forth a logical argument for the Bible being different than any book that's ever been written. But without kind of a foundation in logic, it's going to be difficult to to explain that. So we're going to have to start from the basics and then kind of work our way up. But the main thing that we're going to talk about tonight is that the Bible, among any book that you can think of, has been hated, vilified, ridiculed, criticized, restricted, banned, and destroyed. But that has been to no avail, because it's still classified worldwide as the bestseller of all time. And I just want to do a quick little history lesson of some of the things that have happened where people have tried to stop the Bible itself from being read or distributed, and then look at some of the results of that attempt. So our first one we're going to look at goes all the way back to AD 303, where the Roman Emperor Diocletian issued an edict to stop Christians from worshiping Jesus and to destroy their scriptures. And he commanded that every official in the empire was to raze the churches to the ground and burn every copy of the Bible that they could find.
Yeah.
So 25 years later, Diocletian's successor, Constantine, issued another edict ordering 50 Bibles to be published by government expense and declared Christianity the official religion of Rome.
At that time, they were all hand copied, so that
Yes.
was really a big expense.
Right. Yes. God has an interesting response when people try to put a stop to his word. Here's another example. In 1778, the French atheist Voltaire boasted that within 100 years, Christianity and the Bible would cease to exist. 50 years later, the Geneva Bible Society used Voltaire's house and his printing press to begin their Bible printing operation, and have printed millions of Bibles since then. Today, the Bible is banned or severely restricted in 54 countries around the world. Some places, it's just impossible to obtain, while in others, owning one could get you killed. And so here's a map of all the places where it's either banned or restricted. And the yellow are places where it's restricted. The orange is there's actually penalties for owning one, and the dark orange is where it's banned entirely and you can be killed for owning it. According to God's word, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So this is actually the war that's going on. On one side, you have God revealing truth, and on the other side, you have men suppressing truth. So the big question that we have today, and that's kind of why we're going to do this lesson in logic, is what is truth? And for that, we're going to take a look at a clip from the Gospel of John movie that we just finished and see if you guys remember this one.
Do you think I'm a Jew? It was your own people and the chief priests who handed you over to me. What have you done?
My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish authorities. No. My kingdom does not belong here.
Are you a king, then?
You say that I am a king. I was born and came into the world for this one purpose: to speak about the truth. Whoever belongs to the truth listens to me.
And what is truth?
So how would you answer that? How would you answer the question, what is truth?
Well, if you've got somebody who doesn't believe that the Bible is true, then you've got quite a problem.
Yeah.
What if you have somebody who doesn't believe that truth is true? You know, there's
Oh.
people out there that don't believe that anything is true. You know, what's true for me is not true for you. You know, I can have my own facts and you can have yours. That's kind of the world that we live in right now. So, you know, the question is, what does it take to show that something, no matter what it is true?
For the purposes of illustration, let's take a listen to this Garth Brooks song called Cowboy Bill and see if we can identify some of the elements of evaluating what's true and false.
He told
What's not to like?
a story, and all us kids listened, about his life on the border and the way it was then. And we all believed, and when he would finish, we'd ask the old cowboy to tell him again. He told of a time when he rode with the Rangers down on the Pecos, and he saved the day. Outnumbered by plenty, they were almost to cover, with 30 banditos headed their way. He looked back just in time to see a horse stumble. The captain went down and Bill pulled up on his reins. And through a flurry of bullets, he rescued the captain. They rode for a sunset, just the story remains. And the grown-ups would tell us, you boys keep your distance. That old man's just telling you lies. But to all us kids, Cowboy Bill was a hero, just as true as his blue Texas skies. Well, I still remember the day that it happened. We waited and we waited, but Bill never showed. And the folks at the feed store said they hadn't seen him, so he set out for his place down Old Grist Mill Road. And we cried when we found him lying there with his memories, the old trunk wide open, things scattered about. He was clutching a badge that said Texas Ranger, and in old yellow letters said Texas is proud. And those grown-ups that told us, you boys keep your distance, that old man's just telling you lies. Now they're all saying that Cowboy Bill was a hero, just as true as his blue Texas skies. Just as true as his blue Texas skies.
So that's the question. What changed?
Documentation.
The story was backed up by physical evidence.
Right.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, there were facts and evidence. So all those people that were saying, you know, keep your distance, he's a liar. All of a sudden, their opinion changed. And
Right,
that's,
well, and Bill was also telling them truth as he lived it.
right. Right. Now people are able to tell fibs. You know, there's a lot of people out there that will tell a whole history about themselves that's not true. Most of them are running for political office when they do. But you know, there at some point, you know, there's a way to prove whether or not it's actually true. And so that's really what we want to focus in on. There's 3 ways to determine whether or not something that you hear or that you read or see on TV is actually true or not. Anyone want to hazard a guess, you know, kind of based on that story and that song, you know, what are these 3 things?
Well, one is physical evidence, obviously.
Okay.
You hear it over and over, but there's no changes in it.
Okay. So you would be saying consistency.
Right.
That's another word for that. Okay. All right. There's our first one. Ding, 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 ding. Let's talk about consistency for a second. I think you pretty much nailed it, Nancy, but the way that I would define it would be the material that you're looking at, does it match the actual world that you live in? You know, does it justify the laws and rules that we operate under? Or is it just so, you know, when somebody looks at it, would they say, yeah, that's science fiction? You know, that would never happen. There's just no way. And the other thing is, does nature actually behave in the way that is depicted in the narrative that you're reading? You know, if old Cowboy Bill had talked about when his captain fell down, he was able to, you know, use the force and move him with his mind, then we might have more doubts about the story. But, you know, he says he turned his horse around and he rode back and he got it. You know, that's consistent with the story that he's telling.
Yeah.
All right. So we have consistency. The third thing is, do people in general behave the way that they're depicted in whatever it is that you're hearing? You know, and that also goes to the character of the person that's telling the story. You know, if there's somebody that you know exaggerates, then you're going to be a whole lot less likely to believe, you know, some story that sounds pretty fantastic. But if they're a person that you've known for a very long time and they've never been a person known to exaggerate, and they come running in and knocking on the door and saying the body is gone, then all of a sudden you've got a reason to run down to the tomb and see what's happening. So now we're up to the one that you said, Dan, evidence. And so what is evidence? Evidence is a collection of facts or data points that combine to verify a certain assertion. Just a fact by itself is not evidence. A fact is simply that. It's simply a data point. You have to combine several facts and prove that they follow in an order that leads you to conclude that there's evidence. The other definition that you can have for evidence is the information obtained from documents, objects, or witnesses and is presented in a court of law to try to prove a legal point. And it's a collection of information that leads in a particular direction. And then the last thing is logic. And that's really what we're going to look at. Logic is the universal, immaterial, invariant, and abstract laws that govern reason and discernment. In other words, logic is the thing that takes consistency and evidence and puts them together. It's the glue that holds things together and lets you determine if something is true. Without it, all you have is just a jumble of different facts, and it can be just as confusing as not having any. Logic is what put things together. So when we say it's universal, That means that the laws are the same everywhere. The laws of logic are the same in America as they are in China, as they are in India. They all work the same. It doesn't matter what language you speak, those laws are the same. Now, when we say they're immaterial, it means that this is conceptual, not material. And the third thing is they don't change over time. And this is the one biggie that a lot of our modern scholars have a hard time with, because they want to believe that facts and evidence and truth can change over time. Well, we're smarter today than we were yesterday, so the truth is different today. No, because the laws that determine what's true and not haven't changed. We may know a little bit more, we may have access to more information, but the way that we format our opinion hasn't changed. And then the final one is they're abstract, and that just describes the way that different ideas relate to each other. In other words, it's philosophical. So the big question is, when you look at that about something that is universal, immaterial, invariant, means not unchanging, and abstract, who does that remind you of? Yeah, you're right on track if you said God, because God is the one that logic comes from. Logic is based on the nature of God. Only the existence of a biblical God can even account for the fact that we have logic. There wouldn't be logic if we didn't have a logical God. You cannot get to logic if you allow the whole idea that the world just accidentally formed and that we all just arrived here by a process of evolution that was not controlled, that just happened randomly, and it tried one course and that didn't work, and so a million years later it went a different direction, and then somehow or other we all just ended up here. There is absolutely no basis in a world or a universe like that you would have logic, because that's not a logical process. It's a trial and error process. And so to be able to sit down and reason out something wouldn't work if that's the only thing you had as a standard. However, God himself is immaterial. He's not material. He's universal. He's everywhere. He doesn't change. And he's abstract. And so are his thoughts. And with that, he presents us, who are made in his image, with his logic, and we can go forth and use that logic to develop our reasoning. And because of that gift that he created us in his image, then we are able to develop things like science and medicine. You know, we make airplanes fly because God made us in his image. So if you need the existence of a biblical God to account for the existence of the laws of logic, materialism just doesn't get there. This is the question that people who don't believe in God can't answer, because they can't explain how there's a common standard of rational thought that allows agreements between different people in various parts of the world who have grown up completely culturally separate from each other. No. How can a scientist from India who's grown up under the Hindu religion and some, you know, an Italian scientist who's grown up completely under Catholicism, and another scientist from Saudi Arabia who has grown up in a culture of Islam, and an American scientist who may not even believe in God, how can they all sit down in a room and come to the same conclusion about the truth or falsehood of a certain scientific theory if there's no standard of logic? Because none of their culture gets them to the same place. There has to be something deeper than that. There has to be a way of rationalizing things and reasoning that supersedes whatever their culture and their beliefs are. And that is the trail that leads us to God. So why are consistency and logic so important? The reason for that is that if you allow me one simple contradiction, I can prove anything to be true. I'll give you an example. So if you allow me just one simple contradiction, look what can happen. John is teaching a class on apologetics. John is not teaching a class on apologetics. Either John is teaching a class on apologetics or the Gulf of Mexico is full of green jello. See, because if you believe both of those first two that contradict each other, I can say that anything is true.
Yeah.
Only logic prevents somebody from making assertions that are absolutely ridiculous. But if you allow somebody to twist their argument to the point that they are doing something and are not doing something at the same time, or that A is true and A is not true at the same time, then the next statement can be anything.
Yeah.
And so then, you know, if you look at the following, the last of it here, if you go with, you know, first of all, John is teaching a class, then John is not teaching a class, and you say either John is teaching a class or the Gulf of Mexico is full of green jello, all I have to do is point you back to number 2 and say, no, John is not teaching a class, so therefore I've just proven that the Gulf of Mexico is full of green jello. Because you've already accepted 1 and 2.
Can you give us an example of a contradiction?
Well, I think an easy one to get to is this whole gender issue that we keep hearing about in the news. At one time, we're told that gender is fluid. There's no such thing as just men and women, that you can be 57 different flavors of some sort of gender. And the same exact person will come back and say, it's very important that I have an equal number of women on my team, because that's the only way it's fair.
Okay.
Good example.
It's making something that's totally illogical supposedly follow because you've already accepted 2 completely contradictory premises. Now, here's the big one. Did you know that as a Christian, you are obligated to be rational? Has anybody ever heard that before?
No.
No. Nope.
We're called upon to state truth and not to lie.
Yeah.
So,
Well, here's the
Rational.
interesting thing. We've
That's right
already
with that.
looked at how the characteristic of God is where we get the characteristic of logic and rationality from. And in Ephesians 5:1, we are told that we're supposed to be imitators of God. So if God is rational, if God is logical, then aren't we supposed to be also? Would somebody like to start reading this verse for us?
Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
So God is actually directing people to align their thinking with him, because he's logical, he's rational, and people are not necessarily that way. And if you notice in this verse, it also equates with thinking the way that men do with wickedness. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. You see, it's the thinking that causes the problem. And then God says, you are to align yourself with his thinking, because his thoughts are higher than your thoughts. Would somebody like to read 2 Corinthians 10, 4-5 here?
The weapons we use in our fight are not the world's weapons, but God's powerful weapons, which we use to destroy strongholds. We destroy false arguments. We pull down every proud obstacle that is raised against the knowledge of God. We take every thought captive and make it obey Christ.
And then it says, and we destroy false arguments. Well, how do you destroy an argument? By looking at it with God's logic. This is the whole point of arguing, is that you have to find out, is it consistent? Is there evidence? And is it logical? And the final thing is that we take our own thoughts captive and make them obey Christ. This is what I said. We're obligated to be rational, to be logical. We must control the way that we think. If there's something in us that is being driven by feelings or wishful thinking, we have to basically step back and take a look at it and say, is it true? Because only by doing that can you actually take your thoughts captive and make them obey Christ. So let's get into the keys and the way to avoid being irrational. Since the Bible tells us we're supposed to be rational, we're supposed to be logical and think like God does, how do we avoid doing the opposite? Well, the first thing that we have to do is avoid arbitrariness and inconsistency, or as I put it just a couple minutes ago, basing everything that we think and do off of our feelings and our wishful thinking. You know, that's another way of saying this. This is just the studious way of saying it. You know, don't be arbitrary. Don't just, you know, randomly one day this is true and the next day it's not. And don't be inconsistent. If you're gonna put something forward as true, you have to live that, right? It's okay to be random or arbitrary when you're picking out your wardrobe, unless you have to wear a uniform. But it's not okay to randomly choose your beliefs and arbitrarily decide what's moral or immoral. Little children are arbitrary, and it's cute. But adults are supposed to grow and become rational as they mature. So proclaiming a belief system that's inconsistent with the way that you actually live and behave is usually called hypocrisy by most rational people. So have good reasons for your actions that don't contradict. Here's something that I found just was in the news yesterday that I thought was pretty interesting. It's an article in the Blaze about a woman who claims to be a Christian stripper. She said, God will love you no matter what. She reasoned of reconciling her faith and her profession. That's what I was taught in my household, school, and church. I pray every single night. I pray for whatever I feel I need to that day. I pray for my family, my fans, and myself. She said that her family was Christian, but very laid back. My religion has never interfered or stopped me from doing anything that I've ever wanted to do. So, is that arbitrary and irrational?
Yeah.
Yeah, and inconsistent. And this is the thing that I always tell people when they start getting into my Bible study here, and especially this one where we're starting to look at how to prove that the Bible is true. And that is that this is a very dangerous class. Because if I prove to you that the Bible is true, then you have no excuse for not listening to it. And that's, for some people, a very scary place to be. Obviously, there's two things that that this poor girl doesn't, are either true in her life. One, she's never read the Bible, and so she has no idea what the standards of being a Christian are. Or two, she's read the Bible and she doesn't believe it. And she thinks that she can pick and choose the things out of it that she likes and throw away the rest. So she doesn't trust it and doesn't feel like it's actually true. Other than avoiding arbitrariness and inconsistency, which is the negative, what not to do, then the positive step that you take in order to think more like God, and that is to learn the basics of logic. So there's actually steps to take to become more capable of doing the things that God requires of you as far as your thinking goes. So how do you actually get to that point? And that's why we're going to go through a few items here just to show what logic actually means and how it works. So there are several key terms, not very many, but there's a couple of key terms that you need to remember when you're talking about logic. And logic always deals with proving something to be true. So the first thing in any argument, and by argument, I don't mean like a fight between two people who disagree. I'm talking about an argument being when a lawyer presents his argument to the court. Okay, that means he's presenting his entire case to the judge to prove a particular point. And that's what the word argument means when you're talking about logic. So the first thing you have is a claim. A claim is a statement that something is either true or false. An example of a claim: all dogs are purple. Is that true or false? It's false. Yeah, obviously. But is it a claim? Yes, I made the claim that all dogs are purple. It just happens to be a false claim. So keep that in mind. To have a claim doesn't mean something is true or false. It simply is a claim. The second part is an argument. An argument is a group of claims where the truth of one is said to follow from the others. In other words, if you add 1 and 2, you're going to get 3. That is an argument. That is something following from a list of claims. So here's an example. All mammals have kidneys. All dogs are mammals. Therefore, all dogs have kidneys. Is that true?
True.
Yes, as far as I
true.
know.
So the last thing that you want to learn about logic is the idea of a fallacy. And this comes up when you're trying to convince somebody, particularly of the truth of the Bible or of the existence of God. They will give you an argument that it may sound good, but you have to be able to sit back and reason it through to find out if it's actually a logical fallacy. A logical fallacy is a mistake where the conclusion doesn't actually follow from the facts that they give you. So here we go. Let's take a look at another claim. All dogs are mammals. All cats are mammals. Therefore, all dogs are cats. See, the thing about it is number 1 true?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, all dogs are mammals. Is number 2 true?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, all cats are mammals. But can you follow those 2 statements with, therefore, all dogs are cats?
No.
No, it doesn't. That is a faulty conclusion. And this is the kind of thing that you have to be aware of when you're arguing with somebody about the truth or falseness of something. They can present you with a series of true claims, but then the way they tie them together is absolutely not true. This is what's called a logical fallacy. And in logic, something is either valid or invalid. In this particular case, this is not valid. Because just because all dogs are mammals and all cats are mammals doesn't mean that all dogs are cats or all cats are dogs. That is an invalid statement. So here's another way of presenting some claims. All mammals have fur. 2, reptiles have fur. So all snakes are mammals. What's wrong with that statement?
The second one.
The second one. Within the context of those 3 statements, number 3 is a valid conclusion. Because valid and true doesn't mean the same thing. Valid means that taking it at face value, they have made a statement or an argument that follows. If 1 is true and 2 is true, then yes, 3 is true. So it is a valid argument. It's just not true. This is another way that people will try to mess with you when they are arguing something. They will present you with evidence, and especially if you talk with somebody who is an atheist and very scientific, they will immediately try to go to some place where they think you don't have any expertise. They will immediately say, well, in my biology, in my doctorate level biology class, we learned that microorganisms have a function by which they can evolve within a very short amount of time. Therefore, that proves that evolution is true and God had no part in it. So they try to give you a claim and tell you that it's true and hope that you have no understanding whatsoever of what they're talking about. So you cannot refute 1 or 2. So they're trying to slip in number 2, reptiles have fur. And they're trying to do it because they think you don't know any better. So, if the conclusion doesn't sound right, go ahead. What were you saying, Ed?
I was saying, which reptiles have fur?
Right, they don't. The key to a reptile is reptiles have scales. So it's a false statement. That's why I'm saying, but most people know that snakes aren't furry. Lizards aren't furry. But what if the claim that's being made is being made by an expert in a field that you know nothing about? What if they're saying something that sounds like it could possibly be true? And they're saying, I'm an expert, so I should know. This is where you have to say, okay, we're going to pause this conversation while I go research what you just told me.
Yeah.
Because I'm not, your conclusion doesn't sound right, but I don't know enough about microorganisms to talk to you about this right now. So either you can bring me information to prove that claim is true, or give me a week to go look it up. Somebody explain to me, why is this statement valid even though it's not true?
If the first 2 are true, then the third is true.
Within its own little world, it works. But it doesn't point to truth.
No.
The problem is that none of us are smart enough to know every fact in the whole world. And so we can be presented with claims that we don't know whether or not they're true or not. Okay. So let's try a couple more examples. Number 1, rain wets the ground outside. Number 2, the ground outside is wet. Number 3, therefore, it must be raining outside. Give me some feedback here.
Okay, well, number 2 is false because
No.
number 2,
No,
It
let's
can't
assume
be.
let's assume that it's true. Let's assume that both these statements are true. The
No,
question, though, is, do we have a lack of information?
Yes.
yes.
We know that rain causes the ground to get wet. That's true. And we're assuming that, you know, if somebody's telling us it's wet outside, that we could walk out there and prove, yes, it is wet. But does that mean that rain is the only way that it could have gotten wet?
No.
Could have
No.
been washing the car.
Right, could have been washing the car. Could have had the sprinklers on. You know, the kids could have been were running around chasing each other with the hose. Yeah, there's a whole lot of other explanations. So it doesn't follow because we don't have enough information. And once again, this is another trick that people will play in arguments, is that they give you a couple of true statements, but they leave something important out. And you have to be able to look at their argument and say, wait a minute, you forgot the most important thing. How do we know that this?
Is that valid or invalid, sound or unsound?
It is both invalid and unsound because it doesn't have enough information to prove one way or the other.
Okay.
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 All right. So here's another one. All dogs are cats. Some cats are chickens. Therefore, the sky is blue. Now, here's the interesting thing, though. The conclusion's true.
Sky is blue.
The premises are not.
Right. It's an invalid argument because neither of those things have anything to do with the sky, and neither one of them are true.
Right.
But the conclusion is true. So it's unsound because it doesn't, the sky is blue doesn't follow from either of those things. And it's invalid because they don't, neither of those things prove it, even within itself.
Right.
Because they're not talking about the same things. And when if you get into an argument with somebody who sounds like this, the best thing you can do is just pat them on the head
And walk
and
off.
walk away. All right, here's another one, a little slightly different. All dogs are mammals. All cats have kidneys. Therefore, the sky is blue. So those are the three conclusions that we've had from previous ones. They were all true conclusions. But when you string them together,
It doesn't follow.
they don't follow. The one doesn't prove the next one, which doesn't prove the next one.
No.
Yeah.
It's unsound. It doesn't, you know, everything in there is true, but they're not tied together in any way. Logic completely left the room on this. So these are called deductive arguments. You deduce something by reading one after the other, and then stringing them together to find out if they actually fit. Not all statements can be termed that way. Deductive is much simpler than inductive. Inductive is when you have to actually really step back and think about it. So here's an idea, or here's an example of inductive. Okay, John didn't answer his phone all day, even though I called him a dozen times. Therefore, John must have been away from his office. So inductive requires interpretation, not just claims and addition. So these kind of arguments are not determined to be true or false. They're determined to be strong or weak. So tell me, is this a strong argument or a weak argument?
Weak.
Dick caller ID, so he wasn't answering.
There you go. Once again, it's weak because we don't have all the answers. He may have been in meetings all day, right?
Yep.
We just don't have all the info. Like you said, John may just not have wanted to talk to you. It's a weak argument because there's just not enough information there to prove that conclusion. So let's look at it. Let's look at the second version. John didn't answer his phone all day, even though I called him a dozen times. John rarely answers his phone when he's working. Therefore, John must have been away from his desk all day.
Weak.
It's weak because it disproves itself.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
If John was in the office and busy, he wouldn't be answering his phone.
Mhm.
So it's a weak argument. All right. So our three ways of avoiding being irrational are to avoid arbitrariness and inconsistency, learn these basic rules of logic, and know how to recognize logical fallacies. So those are the three keys to getting started in how to think, how to prove something is true, and how to convince somebody else that what you're saying is true.
Were these not taught in school? I learned them in school.
One of the things that we talked about last week is that almost nobody that I've talked to in years has had any of this in their schooling.
Yeah.
Well, and nowadays, if kids are allowed to get away with saying 2 + 2 = 5, and they say, well, that's fine if that's what you want to say, well, then they're just having their base cut out from under them on that. They're not being taught. They're just saying whatever you think is fine.
And let me ask you a logical question, since that we know that that's what's happening in schools today. Why do you think they're doing that?
So you can get away with anything.
Well, and their teachers don't know any better.
And they don't want them to know the truth.
Self-esteem for the kids. They don't want to make the kids feel bad about being stupid.
Well, I would postulate that the reason that they're doing it is to draw kids further and further from God. Because
Yes.
if you are able to think logically and rationally, then you are thinking the way that God does, and then you are able to take the ideas and the things that you are presented with in this world and come to a conclusion. But if there is no truth, and it all goes back to that thing I showed you in the beginning. If John can both be not teaching a class and teaching a class at the same time, then you can believe anything you want.
Yeah.
Right. So it takes away the absolute truth part and makes everything relative.
Exactly. And the reason that you would do that is because you want the world to become that way. Because like I said at the beginning, you can't have a logical, rational world without the existence of God. So you have to convince everybody that the world is not logical and not rational.
Right. Because if there's absolute truth, then that also would mean that there's a right and a wrong. And if you don't want to have the right and wrong, if you're not going to acknowledge there's right and wrong, there can't be absolute truth.
Right.
Right.
Yep. So there is a reason for all this. It's not just happening. It's just not some silly idea. The devil has a reason for making sure that nobody follows a logical pattern anymore. So let's look at some other ways that logic is betrayed. The first one, and this one is a biggie, is called equivocation, or in less technical terms, it's called bait and switch.
Yeah.
And what that means is that you change the definition of something right in the middle of the argument. This is done all the time. I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's one. Practice makes perfect. Doctors practice medicine. Therefore, doctors are perfect.
Yeah.
What changed in that argument?
The definition of
Definition of
practice.
practice.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. All of a sudden, we're talking about something totally different. You know, how does this show up when you're talking to non-Christians sometimes? The easiest way to see it is a lot of times we'll be talking to somebody who says, God had nothing to do with creation. Everything was done from evolution. Well, that's their conclusion. They're stating this, they're doing this logical thing backwards. They're starting with the conclusion. So you say, oh yeah, well, why is that? Well, because evolution has been 100% proven. We see animals adapt to their environments every day. And therefore, we know that little tiny tadpoles eventually evolved to become you and me.
Nope.
What did they change the definition of?
Evolution.
Evolution. Because in their first claim, when they used the word evolution, they compared it with the word adaptation. We know animals evolve every day. They adapt to their situation. So on one hand, they're saying that animals have adapted. You know, birds have grown longer beaks because the insects are deeper in the trees than the birds in another neighborhood. Or, you know, moths have changed colors so they can blend in with the tree that they're going to sit on. So that's adaptation. But then they turn around the next sentence and they use the word evolution to say that one type of thing can become a totally different organism entirely. That's not the same definition.
Nope.
So it's a logical fallacy called equivocation. It's bait and switch. They give you one definition, and then when you agree with that, they change it. They don't tell you.
Often they don't realize they're doing it either.
Here's another type of fallacy. It's called reification. It's personifying inanimate things to make a more emotional appeal, attributing personal characteristics to a concept or an idea. So here's an example. It's not nice to fool Mother Nature. Or here's another one. This was the big saying in Jurassic Park. Life will find a way. Did you see what they're doing? They're personifying nature. They're personifying life as if life makes decisions. Life itself doesn't think. Here's another way that they do. They say something like, well, creationists say, but science says. Well, creationists are people, so they might say something, but does science talk?
No.
Science is a tool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So reification is personifying something to make an emotional appeal. So here's the next one. It's called bifurcation. It's the either or dilemma. And basically that means that they're setting up a false choice as if you only have two choices. Like saying either the traffic light is red or it's green. Is that a true statement?
No.
No, why?
Because it can be yellow or it can be unplugged.
Yeah, exactly. There are other options. Yeah. Here's another one that I've heard from a lot of people. I don't live by faith, I'm rational.
You can be both.
Yeah.
Well, see, the question is automatically assuming that there is no possible other option. You're either rational or you have faith. But we just talked about that God requires us to be rational. So obviously there's a third choice.
And he also requires us to have faith.
Exactly. Yeah. But the whole thing is it's a statement that's a logical fallacy in and of itself. It's a false statement because it's giving a false option.
Yep.
Same thing, with the next one. I don't trust the Bible. I believe in science. All right. So here's another logical fallacy. It's called begging the question, or we call it circular reasoning. The conclusion simply restates the original premise, which doesn't prove anything. It just assumes that it's correct. The reason that begging the question seems persuasive is that it is a valid argument. Now we're back to that whole valid versus invalid thing. It's valid, but it's not necessarily true. So here's an example. Air is lighter than water because water is lighter than air, or water is heavier than air. Have you proven it? No, you just restated it.
Yeah.
Evolution is true because it's scientific.
Nope.
No.
Nope, you're just restating it in a different way. How about this? The Bible says it's the word of God, and that must be true since God can't lie.
Works for me.
No.
It's still circular reasoning.
Right.
It doesn't prove a thing. And the easiest way to tell if something is circular reasoning is that you can start from either end. You know, if something's a circle, if you start here, you go all the way around and you end up in the same place. It doesn't matter where on the circle you start, you still go all the way around. So you know it's circular reasoning if you can start with the opposite end and still end up at the same place. So in the last one, you can say
Says
God doesn't lie, therefore he says his word is true, therefore it's true. You can start from either end of that and end up at the same exact place. So you haven't proven anything. You've just made a claim. All you've done is number one in an argument. You've just presented a claim. You just restated it, but you haven't gotten any further. You haven't proven a thing. But people do this all the time, and they think that they've just made this wonderful, proof of something. Yeah. Now we've talked about begging the question. Here's begging the claim. So what this does is it assumes that a claim has already been proven. So they throw something out and then skip right by it as if that's all. We all know that's true. So then we'll use that to prove something else. But it's stated in a highly emotional way, just trying to hide it. Like saying filthy and polluting coal should be banned. What's the claim in that statement?
Coal is filthy and polluting.
Right. Have they proven that?
No.
Here's another one. Evolution versus creationism. How is that a claim? What are they doing there that is faulty? Well, look at the way that they phrase those two words.
Stating them against each other.
Right.
Yeah,
but are they equals?
No.
Because they're calling creationism versus evolution as being stated as a
fact.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because evolution in and of itself is a scientific theory.
Right.
Creationism, and ism is a belief system. Communism is the belief that a certain way of government is the right one.
Yeah.
So what they're doing is they're comparing apples and oranges. They're comparing a way that's, if they said evolution versus creation, that's two ways of phrasing something where you're comparing apples to apples. Evolution is a belief in the way that things might have happened, and creation is a way of looking at the way that things might have happened. You can compare those two things equally.
Yeah.
But evolution is a fact-based statement. Creationism is a slur. So you automatically, just from the statement, know that you're dealing with somebody who is using a logical fallacy to try to beat you down. Here's another word. The Bible says the world was created in 6 days, but the best scientists say it's billions of years old. What unproven claim are they using?
That's what they say. They haven't proven anything. They just say it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's several of them in there. Number one, the best science. You see what they're doing? See, they're using a claim that is not proven.
Yeah.
How do you know the best scientists say this? What determines them to be better than another scientist who doesn't say it? You haven't proven that at all. but they're
Right.
throwing it out there. That's called begging the claim. They're just throwing something out there that you're supposed to just go, okay, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. You know, in the first place, that, you know, if you go on from there, you know, if you skip the best scientist things, you know, the billions of years old things. Well, yeah, like Linda was saying, you know, well, they say it's billions of years old, but I'm not going to accept that as true until you prove it. And then, of course, you've got the old complex question fallacy. Like, when did you stop beating your wife?
No good answer.
Right. Yeah, you can't answer that question.
Mhm.
You know, because the question itself is faulty. You know, here's another version of the same question. Why are you Bible believers against science? This is really a complex question for a lot of people, and that is, have you repented of your sins? Why is that just like, when did you stop beating your wife?
Well, that assumes that you are sinning.
There you go. There you go. Now, we know as Christians that every man has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Right.
But to ask that of somebody who does not believe, to them, that is a complex question. That is like saying, when did you stop beating your wife? Well, I've never sinned. I don't know. How do you know I've sinned? You don't know me. You know, maybe I'm a really good person. You know, to them, that's, you know, so you have to take a step back and you have to prove to them your claim first. Now, if you're talking to somebody that you know is a notorious wife beater and you ask them, when did you stop beating your wife? That's a legitimate question. But otherwise, it assumes too much.
Right.
That's why complex questions don't work, because they assume more information than you can know. When you're dealing with somebody who is not a Christian, you have to go back and say, have you ever told a lie? Well, yeah, I've told lies. Well, did you know that according to God, telling a lie is a sin and sinners can't get into heaven? So do you realize you need to repent from your sins and accept Jesus for your salvation? You have to prove your case. Otherwise, you're just assuming something that you may not be on the same page with the person you're talking with. We just want to make sure that as Christians, we're not making logical fallacies when we talk to people. Here's another one that I hear all the time, and this is the no true Scotsman argument. And it is a huge fallacy. It goes like this. No Scotsman puts sugar in his tea. Angus is a Scotsman and he uses sugar. Well, no true Scotsman would put sugar in his tea. Say, just back to the evolution idea. Somebody will say, no scientists believe in creation. And you say, I have several friends who are PhD scientists and they believe in creation. And they turn around and say, well, no real scientists would believe in creation.
Right.
It's a logical fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
Because what it's saying is that only real scientists are the ones that believe what I believe. Only real scientists are the ones who agree with me.
No true Scotsman.
The thing about it is that you can always tell a no true Scotsman argument is that it's being so biased and arbitrary that you can prove it's false just by reversing it. And all you've got to do is just take, when somebody does this and says, just like the last one, and says, you know, when no scientists believe in God, and you say, well, I know a lot of scientists that believe in God, and they say, well, no real scientists believe in God. All you've got to do is reverse it on them and say, well, I think all scientists believe in God. And they say, well, I just told you that scientists don't believe in God. And you say, well, no real scientist wouldn't believe in God.
Yeah.
See, you're just turning the stupidity right back on them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the easiest way to prove a no true Scotsman argument. If you can just swap the words of whatever point that they're trying to make and feed the same thing right back to them, it's a logical fallacy.
Mhm.
You know, and it doesn't matter whether it's about God or it could be about your garbage collector. You know, the garbage collector's always here before 9 o'clock in the morning. Well, he came at 11 yesterday. Well, no, real garbage man would come after 9. You know,
He's a fill-in.
right? Yeah, it's something that just doesn't make any sense. It's not a real argument. But for any arbitrary claim, there's an equal and opposite arbitrary claim. And neither one is true, but when you reverse it, it just shows how silly the first one was.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, you know, when you hear something that just starts to really make, you know, like, wait a minute, start thinking in your head, can I turn this around and say exactly the same thing to prove it's the opposite? All right. Other quick ones. I'm sure you've probably heard, you know, all of these. Ad hominem means that you attack the person instead of the argument that they're making, you know.
Right.
Well, I'm not going to believe what you say about God because you're ugly. Has nothing to do with what you say, you know.
Right.
The other one, circumstantial. You blame your position on your circumstances. You know, I'm a Christian. I believe in God. Well, you know, you're an American. All Americans believe in God. I'm from Germany. I'm much smarter than America. You know, I'm not a stupid American. You know, that's a circumstantial argument. It has nothing to do with something being true or not. But all the time you hear excuses made for people. Well, they're just rioting because they're poor.
Because they're poor.
Yeah.
Or they don't have a job.
Right. You know, you can substitute whatever, but it's relevant. How is that relevant? How it's okay for them to riot because they're poor?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not. So you have to look for arguments that use somebody's circumstances as the proof for whatever it is that you're trying to prove. A straw man. A straw man argument is when you misrepresent something that somebody is telling you in order to make your point. In other words, you totally misunderstand on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
An appeal to authority. That's another one that you hear all the time. Of course it's true because so-and-so believes it.
Carl Sagan.
Yeah. Whatever, you know. I mean, I've heard people say, you know, well, of course this is true because our pastor said so. But just being able to quote somebody who is, you know, supposedly important doesn't make your argument true.
That's true.
Yeah. An appeal to ignorance is another one. It's true because you can't prove it's not true.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I was abducted by aliens.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't prove that I wasn't. So it's got to be true.
You know, I think I've heard most of these fallacies today on TV.
You hear them all the time, but that's why we look at that verse from Isaiah where it said, you know, the thoughts of man are wicked and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, because that's the common thing. Men's thinking is full of logical fallacies, and most people never question their own thinking. So I'm going to play just a portion of this little video here and then let you guys see if you can pull out some of the logical fallacies that you hear.
Of God, the holy creator's one important communication to mankind. I would expect it to contain wonderful practical things that could help us during our life on earth. But it fails miserably to do that. For example, the human writers of the Bible did not know about the germ theory of disease. The fact that many diseases are caused by microorganisms, which was discovered in the 19th century. But surely God would have known this. A few simple hints like, wash your hands before you eat or prepare food, or don't put your toilet too close to your water supply, could have saved millions of lives from suffering and dying from dysentery, many of them children.
Okay. So you see the argument that he's making.
The Bible, because it's in there.
There you go. See, that's the whole thing. If God gave us the Bible, he would have included things like wash your hands before eating, or bury human waste far away from the camp. Yeah, and he
But it's
did.
right there.
It's all over the Bible.
Yeah.
So once again, you know, he's begging the claim. He's making a claim that God didn't say these things, and yet they're all over the Bible. But he's saying that it didn't. The Bible doesn't say these things, therefore the Bible isn't from God. And I'll tell you, this particular argument right now is one of the arguments that atheists think is their strongest argument yet.
Really?
It's all over YouTube. At least know the thing that you're arguing against. And the thing about it is, it's valid within itself. It's a valid argument. It's just not, it just doesn't follow because it's not true. If all those things were true, yes, that would be a way to prove that the Bible wasn't true. But the claim itself is false. You know, and I you know, here's just a couple. I don't think I even have to tell you guys because you know the Bible, but there are scriptures throughout the Old Testament where God is, you know, sometimes you read through it and you think God is like Monk. You know, he's obsessive about washing. And he tells the Israelites exactly how far out of the camp they have to go, and they have to take a shovel with them to make sure they bury their waste. And, you know, he goes even further than that. He gets into the whole thing about quarantine, which is something that nobody knew anything about. You know, so all of these things, he has a list of hundreds of things that if you touch this, if you touch that, if you touch this other thing, you have to wash, you have to stay away from, you know, if you touch a dead thing that looks like it died from a disease, you have to wash yourself 3 times a day for 12 days before you come back into the camp. You know, you know, these were things that God told the Israelites. And, you know, obviously God didn't say, well, I'm going to tell you all about the theory of germs. There's these little tiny microorganisms that eventually 2,000 years from now, they're going to call bacteria. And I'm going to tell you all about it because it's going to save you from a lot of heartache and disease. No, God didn't do that. He just simply said, if you touch something that's dead, wash your hands. Before you eat your food, wash your hands. You know, if you need to dispose of your waste, go this far out from the camp and don't go anywhere near one of your water supplies. But he didn't explain it.
Even in the Civil War, the surgeons didn't wash their instruments or their hands after doing surgery, and
that's right.
Just spread disease more and more that way.
Here's some of the other, you know, we saw the begging the claim, you know, and he goes on to ask this question: why didn't God just give mankind antibiotics and vaccines? Well, that would have been pretty hard to deal with without refrigeration and, you know,
and steel.
Yeah. Needles. He also uses a straw man argument. He goes on to say that all the Bible teaches about disease is curses and laying on of hands. Well, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible has all kinds of stuff in there about the things that cure other things. He also uses, we ended it on this, if you remember, he uses the appeal to emotion. He said it could have prevented millions of people from dying, even the children.
Yeah.
You know, like God doesn't care about the children, or he would have told them. You know, it's an emotional appeal. Has no basis in fact, and he hasn't proven anything of the contrary, but he's just trying to get people riled up by using a hyperbolic argument. All right. So over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to present a logical argument for the Bible, one that establishes it as the only book that can be proven to come from God. And in order to do this, I'm going to compare it with other religious texts, many from ancient times as well, and with known facts that have been recently proven by the scientific method. So some of the texts that we're going to look at are from the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks and Romans, Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianism, and Islam. And it's against those other texts that we're going to compare the Bible and see if there's a big difference or not. And we're going to compare the Bible on 6 different criteria to see if, in fact, the Bible is different than these other books. So we're going to compare it against scientific facts, fulfilled prophecies, archaeologies, internal consistency, eyewitness testimony, and God's promises. And so that is the intro to what we're going to start with next week.
How do we find this on YouTube?
Well, I'll have to put, it's going to take me a while to edit it down and upload it and everything. And hopefully by next week, I can give you the link.